Today's segment is about the GDP, or the gross domestic product. As a definition, GDP represents the total value of goods and services produced in the economy. We're talking about final goods rather than intermediate, so final goods produced in the economy in 1 year. We express that in dollar terms, and for the United States for 2006, the GDP was of $13 trillion. Just to give you an idea how much this is, a billion is 1,000 million, and a trillion is 1,000 billions. We are not at zillions or gazillions yet. So this is how much it would represent if you were to write this out. So that's $13 trillion, which is the value of all final goods and services produced in the U.S. economy in 2006. How fast would we want the GDP to grow? For the United States, we would like it to grow at about 3%. 3% because if you grow too fast, then we're going to experience shortages in raw materials, in factors of production, and that would bring prices up, which would increase the cost of production, and it would create inflation. So that's not something we want. If we grow very slowly, let's say at 1%, then we do not generate enough jobs for newcomers, people entering the labor force, to find new occupations. Jobs will not be created as fast as people are entering the labor force. For us, 3% is actually the speed at which we would like to grow, but there are many countries that are growing at a much faster rate, and those are countries that are catching up. China is one of those, and their growth was of 14% when they first started. And right now it averages about 9 to 10%, which, of course, for us would be way too high. And in the fall, actually today, this is the spring of 2007, we can see that already China is concerned about prices going up, about inflation, and they're starting to slow down the economy. The other thing that we need to do is look at per capita, or how much are we producing per unit of population. So the way we would do that, we would divide the $13 trillion by 300 million, and that would represent how much each one of us would receive, how many goods and services we would get if the GDP was distributed very equally, which of course we all know that it is not. Another reason why it's important to look at per capita is because this way we will be able to compare in a better way different economies. If you're looking at the second largest economy, the Japanese economy, well, their GDP is roughly half that of the United States. Does this mean that the Japanese population is half as wealthy or has half as many goods? And the answer is no, because we have to look at their population. Their population is roughly half that of ours. So per capita, we are probably roughly at the same spot. Now, the next thing we need to know about the GDP is what are the components. And the components will be C for consumption, I for investments, which is businesses, G for government, and the net exports, which will be the difference between exports and imports. Since the U.S. economy is importing more than it is exporting, we have a trade deficit. So now, which one of those would be the largest component? Remember, the GDP, that's the production of goods and services for the population. And indeed, C, consumers are by far the largest component. They represent about 70% of all output. Now, net exports is a relatively small percentage. It's about exports themselves or imports themselves are a relatively small portion. But since we are going to offset them, then this is going to be a very small number. Now, when you're looking at investments, we're looking at businesses buying machines, building factories. This is not you buying a share of Microsoft. That's not the investment that we're looking at. It's what actually happens in the production possibility. So generally speaking, investment would be the second largest and government would be the third. Now, of course, it all depends on where we are when it comes to the political aspect. So 2006, we are still at war, and therefore the government is spending so much more than it would have spent if we did not have to spend on the military. So these are the four components, roughly in terms of their importance, although, as I said, these two might change in terms of the level. Now, the next thing is, how are we going to calculate the GDP? And we have two ways of calculating. One will be the expenditures approach, how much is being spent, and the other one is going to be the incomes approach. Basically, what we're saying is that the value of the goods that have been produced is equal to the incomes that have been generated in order to produce those goods and services. So if you spend, let's say, $2,000 for your PC, there are some workers who have earned wages and salaries. It was produced in a building, in a factory that was rent. There were machines that were used. That would be for capital interest. And also, somebody had to make money on that, and that would be profit. So roughly, the same amount, the $2,000, is also expressed in terms of incomes that have been generated. But I'm sure that you keep in mind that you also paid a sales tax, which is which will make the two not quite equal, but we will, for all practical purposes, we are going to say that these are roughly the same. So, expenditures, how many cars have we produced, times price per car, plus how many telephone conversations we have used, times the price per telephone conversation, and so on and so forth. We're adding apples and oranges, or cars and telephone conversations, and we are able to put them together because we're going to express them in dollar terms. We will also add all the machinery and equipment that businesses have spent on in terms of investments, and so on and so forth. So that would be the expenditures approach. To incomes, we have four types of incomes, although later on we are also going to be adding proprietor's income. But for simplification, let's see, wages and salaries go to labor, rent goes to land, interest goes to capital, and profit goes to the entrepreneur. So here are the two ways of calculating GDP. Expenditures and incomes, and they are going to be roughly the same. Not identical, but for all practical purposes, we will say that they are the same, because it just tells us that people have earned enough money in order to buy all the things that we have produced. Now, there is another thing that we would like to point out, and that would be the difference between nominal and real GDP. Now, nominal GDP is the GDP that is expressed in the dollars of that particular year, while real GDP will be corrected for changes in prices. It will express the actual purchasing power, how many of those goods we are able to purchase. So, nominal GDP is expressed in the dollars of that particular year, while real GDP is going to be corrected for change in prices. As an example, in 1978, the US economy hit a GDP of $2 trillion. That was the first time in history. We were all very proud. Now, $2 trillion at that time represented a much larger purchasing power for goods and services, because prices then were lower. And so if prices between then and now have doubled, to express this 1978 GDP of $2 trillion, we would have to say, well, today you would need $4 trillion to be able to buy what you were able to buy in 1978. And that would be your real GDP, corrected for inflation. Why is this important? Because we would like to be able to compare how well economies are doing between years and how well people are doing. So, back again to the example of the GDP in 1978 to the GDP of 2006. Well, you can see a huge increase, a sixfold, more than sixfold increase, because right now we have $13 trillion. But actually, if we said that prices have doubled, then that 13 trillion would really be only a $6.5 trillion economy in the value, the purchasing power of dollars as they were in 1978. So now, although GDP is an excellent measure of the performance of the economy, there are several things it does not show or it does not express. Remember, it is a dollar value that we are looking at. The most important thing that it does not show is the underground economy. Underground economy is not necessarily an illegal economy. Underground economy means it has not been declared. No taxes have been paid on those economic activities. 2/3 of all the activities that are part of the underground economy are not illegal. Let's say that you are you have a problem with your sink. You call the plumber, and the plumber comes and says, "Well, it'll be $150, but if I were to come after hours and you were to pay me cash, I could do that for $100." Now, there is nothing illegal for the plumber to fix your sink. But, of course, that $100 is not going to be declared. Taxes are not going to be paid on it. And as a result, the government is going to be losing out. So the underground economy is something that is not reflected in the GDP. For the United States, we feel that it's about 10 to maybe even as high as 20% of the GDP. Another thing that is not reflected in the figures, the $13 trillion, is the fact that a lot of the activities are do-it-yourself activities. So household production. If you buy flour in the market, this is a final good. It's going to be counted as final good. But you will not be consuming flour as such. You will be using it in order to produce cookies or baked goods. Now, the cookies, of course, have a higher value than the different ingredients. But the transformation of the ingredients into the cookies is not going to be counted in the GDP. So if more women enter the labor force and more of the services that they provide are going to be included, then that is going to make our GDP bigger. Babysitting rather than mom sitting at home with the children. Household cleaning. Maybe you're going to have somebody come in once a week to do some chores and pay them. If you pay them and this is going to be declared, then your GDP is going to be higher. Another thing that is not reflected is the quality of the goods. We know that maybe a lot of the increase is just a result of an increase in the price of the items and not necessarily that we are happier and have more, better quality of goods to consume. Nothing is said by the GDP figures about how that income is distributed. Is it distributed equally, unequally? We don't know. We tried with the per capita, and that still is not a good reflection. Income distribution is another topic we will look at later on. Pollution. If there is a disaster, if there is an earthquake, and roads are destroyed, buildings have crumbled, is this adding to the economy? No, but it is going to be adding to the GDP because people are going to be paid to tear down the freeways, to rebuild those factories. But it doesn't mean that we're going to be better off because we have lost a lot of the factories. And then a last part is leisure. Leisure is not going to be calculated as part of the GDP because it is time that you're enjoying away from anything that is part of the market exchange.